are live. So give us 1 second just to make sure it's up and running, and then I will hand the proceedings over to our fearless leader, Sherry. And
I wouldn't say fearless.
all right, sometimes a little afraid.
Definitely fearful.
I doubt it. I doubt it, Sherry.
Not too fearful, that's for sure. All right, great. But before I do, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and obviously, I want to thank Judith for making this possible tonight.
All right. Well, I just want to welcome you all you folks tonight. It's a wonderful group, and we're happy to have you here. It's my great pleasure to have Judith Wechsler be our speaker tonight. Jim said I should just, introduce her with a couple sentences, but her resume, her biography is so remarkable that it's really impossible to. Can you all hear me all right? Yeah.
Yes.
It's impossible to just say it in 2 sentences. So I'm just going to read some excerpts from it. Judith Wechsler is an art historian and filmmaker, has written and directed 29 films, predominantly on art, and for the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts, and with the Comédie Française. She was assistant and associate professor of art history at MIT, at the National Endowment for the Humanities, professor of art history at Tufts, visiting professor at Harvard, École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and the Hebrew University. She's the author of books on Cézanne and Daumier, and articles, catalog essays, and reviews. And this is my favorite one. The French government awarded Wechsler the title of Chevalier d'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. And Jim and I want to have a government award us too. But that's my favorite. Judith lives in Cambridge and has been a member of the Minions since 1990. And we're just thrilled that she's here to talk about the film about her father, Nachum Glatzer.
Actually, I began attending the Minion in about 1960.
Oh, 1960, that's a scribal error. I'm sorry.
No, it's 1990. I became an official
member,
member of worship and study.
Okay,
but
got it.
we went when Josie was 3 years old, and my grandfather used to lead some of the services. Your grandfather, my father, the services on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. So,
yes, I remember seeing him there many times.
Now, let me ask: how many of you who have seen the film by way of Canopy? Or
oh, good,
very good. Did you also see the second part, which is called Additional Scenes, by chance? I looked at it today, and I'd quite forgotten what was all in there, but it was quite amazing. And then I wished I had made the film longer and it had included the additional scenes as part of the regular one, because I found there is my father talking about meeting Bialik. Rabbi Gold speaks in it. He also is in the film itself, but he talks more in this wonderful occasion we had on the anniversary of my father's 100th birthday at the Morgenthau's house, and many people spoke about him, and I filmed it.
How can we see that? Is that
yeah.
If you go to the link to the film on my father, just beneath it says additional scenes.
Oh,
and there
interview
with Mr. Stendhal and with Freya von Moltke. And there's just a lot of wonderful scenes in there. Everett Fox speaks more, Francis Molina, Abby Gilman. There's a lot of rich material. But now let me go to what I've prepared to say, and then I invite your questions.
Did you get Jim to record it?
Yeah. Some 60 years ago, and one of the many times that I drove with my father from where we lived in Watertown to Brandeis, he would teach me various things, various sayings in German or in Greek. And one of them translated was a saying of Goethe, which in translation reads, "What you have inherited from your fathers, you must acquire in order to possess it." And this has always been very much on my mind. And I think the decision to make the film had to do with one of the ways I hope to acquire and convey this rich inheritance and to give other people a sense of all that he did and represented. As you know, my father was a well-known scholar whose life exemplified a kind of scholarly integrity. His many students speak to that. And also about the revival of the Judaic tradition as an existential and a moral force, given that he lived through both actually the First and the Second World Wars. His life is a paradigm of forced movement from culture to culture and an emblem of what lives on in the transition. Wechsler's scholarship was inclusive and ecumenical, from the Bible to Kafka. I felt his life was not only worth documenting for the sake of his scholarly legacy, but it also shows how a particularly thoughtful, sensitive, brilliant person and scholar could come to terms with the cataclysm of his century and address philosophically and theologically the problem of evil. More practically, it concerns how he made a new life as a scholar devoted to the understanding of Judaism in modern times and in the context of America. I began working on the film the year my father died in 1991. I had already long been making films on art, but at that point I bought a video camera and went with my mother to Frankfurt. My parents had been invited a number of times to come as visitors, as guests of the city to Frankfurt. Many people were invited. My father always said, no, I have no interest in going. But after he died, my mother received another such invitation. She said, would I like to, she would go if I would go with her. And I said, I'd be very interested in doing that. And I thought I would document it. So I bought a video camera and filmed her reminiscing as we went to the neighborhood in which she lived, the way she walked to school, the gardens, just all kinds of memories. And it was really the beginning, this desire to document something of my parents' life. I also began to film conversations with people they knew who were then in their 90s, because I figured whether I make a film on my father or not, this should be documented. And so in Jerusalem, I filmed a long interview with Tony Simon, with Friar von Moltke in Vermont, and with Bishop Christoph Stendhal here in Cambridge. And from there, I went on to filming his extraordinary students who became eminent scholars themselves, Michael Fishbane and Paul Mendes Floor. And I also filmed interviews with Hilary Putnam, with Rabbi Gold, and with Susanna Heschel and others. I still wasn't sure I was going to make a film, but I just thought it's important to have this documentation. After my mother's death in 1995, hundreds of letters that my parents exchanged came into my possession. Whenever they were apart, they wrote. And of course, before email and before cell phones, before all the technology where we immediately lose the communications after a short time, I have hundreds and hundreds of letters going back to their early romance, when my mother, when he fell in love with her first when she was about 16, he was her tutor. They became engaged when she was 19, and if they were apart, they wrote. And this was a pattern that went on for the rest of their lives. But my German is not very good. And so I asked a close friend of my mother's, Ruth Schocken, not related to the Schocken family, but a pianist from Berlin who lived in Cambridge, and who I trusted with whatever would be revealed in the letters because she was such a close friend and a wonderful person. We began meeting every week to translate. I say we only in the sense that I knew the abbreviations, I could read the handwriting. When there were words in Hebrew, I could translate those, and I began to learn much more German in the process. But one of the things that Ruth felt was she thought I should learn German. My parents had decided when they came to America that they did not want my brother to speak German, though it must have been his first language. And when I was born, they decided they would only speak English around us. So I didn't learn German, but Ruth began to train me. I was her worst student, she said. But as a pianist who taught at Langy School for many years, she was a coach for German diction. for music students wanting to sing Lieder or German opera. And she had a terrific ear. So while I have a pretty good ear, she would correct me to the nth degree. As a result, I have an uncannily good accent, which is completely deceptive since I don't actually know German very well at all. But I began to learn a lot more in the process of doing this film. I decided to bring all this material together as a film, and a couple of my graduate students at Tufts helped. Tamar Avishai, who's actually a member of the Minyan because Bernie Avishai and Sidra Ezrahi are, created a database of all the translations and scanned some 400 photographs and documents. And the young editor who was just graduating from Tufts, this was the first film she had worked on, but was tremendously talented, Erica O'Connor, worked with me on the editing. At first, the film was more focused on my father's intellectual life, but Josie, my daughter, sitting here, said she thought that, and who was very close to her grandfather, felt that the film should be more personal. I took her view very seriously and tried to find a balance between my father's personal life and his intellectual and spiritual development. The two are interconnected. Research for documents began at the University of Frankfurt, where I went a couple of times. Remarkably, his records as a student were there. Every course he took, his grades, his professors. It was extraordinary to find that all these folders had somehow been saved. The first time I went was wonderful because nobody had touched them, I think, since the 30s. They were full of dust. They were, documents that were somehow just left in the state they had been. And I didn't photograph them or film them at the time. Unfortunately, when I came back the next time to Germany, perhaps a year later, I went regularly to Frankfurt. They had been cleaned up. They'd been transferred to new folders. It was, not what one wants as a documentary filmmaker, although I was very glad that they were taking good care to preserve these documents. There were also some family documents, strangely enough, in those files, and a copy of my passport, which I really didn't understand because it was my passport from when I was a child. I think it came from the time that my father was seeking, what is the term? Compensation for having been let go from the university and having left Germany. It never worked out. I had a fellowship at the American Academy in Berlin in 2010. And it was then that I applied really to do the research for a film on my father. That's when it got very serious. I took trips, I worked not so much in the archives in Berlin, but they were able to get me whatever materials I needed from many sources. And I took a trip with Ben, my husband, to Lviv in Ukraine, which had been Lemberg in the Austro-Hungarian Empire when my father was born. With the help of somebody in a bare bones office, which had no files at all, which was the Office for Jewish Culture or so, I learned that many of the street names had been changed because I was looking for the house in which my father had grown up. And in fact, she guided me to it and I photographed it. And it appears in the film, and to the hospital where he was probably born, which was just a 5-minute walk away. It was very, exciting just to begin to see these places, although it didn't really speak to what his life was like. They left Lemberg during the start of the First World War and moved steadily westward. So during the time in Berlin, I took a second trip with Ben to the Czech Republic to visit the town where my father attended gymnasium. It was then called Bodenbach and is now called Decin. The woman at the front desk at the hotel was very helpful, locating the various streets, and after hours walked around with me to find these various locations. I also saw the synagogue that they rarely attended. My father was considered radical to the synagogue, and so they wanted to keep him at some distance. He had his own little congregation when he was 15, 16, 17 years old, in which he gathered the assimilated Jewish students and told them of Jewish lore and Bible stories. And so he was very involved in education from the start. Much of the film would be guided by what I learned from the correspondence, particularly the correspondence between my parents. But in it, my father writes of the death of his father, of his relationship to Franz Rosenzweig. He writes about the decision to leave Germany in March of 1933 in a letter to Martin Buber, and his conflicted feelings about leaving Palestine in 1937. The numerous telegrams that tell of the obstacles in trying to be admitted to the US in 1938 were among the documents. My father kept everything. He was an archivist by nature, so the documentation was extraordinary. Bus tickets, and apparently they went through Monaco and they had gone to the casino. Not exactly the image of my father. I don't know that they bet on anything, but there were the stubs from having attended the casino in Monte Carlo. This was a bit of a revelation. When my parents left Frankfurt in 1933, it was just with a small suitcase and a visa to go to Paris for the weekend, and they never returned. That was their plan, that they would leave Germany inconspicuously and go on by way of Paris to London, where my maternal grandparents had already moved from Frankfurt, to figure out their next steps. Although my father was offered a fellowship at Oxford and a teaching position at the University of London, as you know from the film, he turned them down in order to go to Palestine, where his widowed mother was, his siblings, and because they were cultural Zionists. But life there would turn out to be just too difficult. There was no university position. There was one university at the time, and many scholars having left Germany just at that time. So I was very fortunate. There was so much documentary material, and I found it was all here in my apartment. There was an endless resource of finding the books. I found the copies of Kant and Hegel that Franz Rosenzweig had and that his mother Adela had given to my father. I found an early edition of Bialik's poetry, which Widener Library didn't have, and which was the one that he must have studied from. So I found amazing materials in the process. I was also very fortunate that there was a long interview that was conducted by Chaim Potok with my father. And although the quality of the sound wasn't very good, I was able to use I drew a lot of material from it because it helped really to construct the narrative of the film. I wanted to keep my own voiceover as a narration to a minimum and have as much as possible be in my father's voice. As I said, I decided to keep the film to an hour because I thought it would be useful if anybody wanted to use it in the context of a classroom. But having looked just this morning, because I hadn't looked at the additional scenes in the 10 years since the film was made, I found much material of value. Now I wish I had made the film longer and included all of that. So these are some of the things that went into the making of the film. I'd welcome any thoughts, comments, questions. Or you can I guess, let me check the chat. Let me see.
You need this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you have any questions, I suggest.
Go into the chat.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Judith. This was really wonderful. It was we saw the film twice. And this time, we're presently taking a class, a Maya class, sponsored by the Hebrew College in how, well, I don't exactly how to say it, but the tension between modernity and Judaism and how various philosophers dealt with that issue. And your father was a perfect example of that, of someone who made that, a complete transition between having started in an Orthodox in the Breuers yeshiva and then really immersed himself in the Enlightenment and then melded the two. And that's one of the things. There was so much in that film, but that struck me.
Thank you. It's very true. I mean, as he says in the film, I'll come to you in a second, Harriet, that he never really left behind the tradition. It always meant a tremendous amount to him, but he had to find his way in balancing his deep attraction to modern German literature, to theater, to classical music, to so much that was not part of the Jewish world, and to find a balance between the two. And he said it was quite complex and sometimes difficult to figure it out, but he said I had to do it because I had to maintain both. They were both very important to him.
He embodied that synthesis. That
Yeah.
was what he was.
Exactly. Harriet, did you have your hand raised?
Yes, I had a question. I had a question about you as a filmmaker. Now, coming to this, you had made a lot of films on French art. I know. I remember seeing one of them on Monet. And my question is, coming to making a film about your father, from all these films about French art, I'm just curious, what kinds of filmmaking insights you could take from your work as an art film, and what had to be done anew that you had to deal with that you didn't ever have to deal with making films about Monet or Cézanne and so forth. How did your talents and experience as a filmmaker both come into this, and yet something different was needed here?
Thanks, Harriet. It's really a wonderful question. I mean, you get to the heart of what the challenge was. It's true, because the first 23 films were all on art. Then there was a film on 19th century French actress. So that was a different kind of documentation. But I think making the film on my father, there were two things. One was I did want to make it as visual as possible, even though what we were talking about was the word. I mean, it was so much was about text and context, but not about visual elements per se. But I think I was particularly concerned to find whatever I could that was visually interesting. So seeing his actual diary pages or seeing the books themselves, documents have their own kind of visual interest, and to make the editing lively. And here, the brilliance of this very young, inexperienced editor brought a lot to it, because, for instance, the opening, the idea of seeing those film strips with Susanna Heschel's voiceover, that was Erica's idea, or the superimposition sometimes of letters and photographs. We try to make it as visual as possible, even though it was about words. But I also find words on a page beautiful to look at. I mean, so if one looks at sort of the visual quality of type on page, it's something that I used a lot in the subsequent films on Walter Benjamin, on Svetlana Boym, and on Isaiah Berlin, where often I'm filming just a page or I'm filming words, because it has its own kind of visual interest. And yeah, so I wanted to make an interesting film. I didn't want to just make a flat documentary. Many documentaries are that way, but I wanted to make it as visually compelling as I could. There's one painting in it. While I was in the process of making the film, I had gone to Russia for 10 days and went to the Hermitage, and there was this beautiful painting by Rembrandt of an old Jew. And I photographed it. And when my father talks about the tutor he had in Bodenbach, who lived by the river and who was very poor, I used the photograph I took of the Rembrandt. It's the one work of art that's in the film. Nobody ever objected. Ellie?
It's right there.
I wanted to say that I thought you evoked pictures even with your words, and I especially loved the description of you as a child in his study and how you could be silent together and still in communication. And I wonder if you have any insight into what must have been many factors that made him such a kind and tolerant person, because in many ways our backgrounds are somewhat similar. My father was born in Germany and went to school in Berlin, and but there was this argumentative and on guard side to him that never quite allowed what I feel about your father, a kind of kindness and interest in you and tolerance of you as a child. And I just would love to know more about what you think made that possible, even though he struggled and suffered and all that.
Who knows what makes us
Yeah.
certain traits? I mean, he was deeply thoughtful, gentle, kind. I mean, it's who he was. I mean, it wasn't that he didn't have very rough times.
Yeah. No, I
He
can't.
did, but he was never embittered.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't optimistic. He wasn't Pollyannish. He had a sense of the dark side of human nature when he experienced that in Germany. His enormous affinity and with Kafka was the writer who was closest to his heart.
I loved seeing, I loved seeing your parents as young people because I knew them later and from a bit of a distance, but to see them as young people, even you had not seen them that young. And so you were giving us pictures of them as you were discovering them, which is really beautiful.
There was a great gentleness. And what I discovered in the correspondence, as a kid growing up, you don't have the sense of your parents as romantic people.
Yeah.
And yet to see these letters, which were so touching. My father would write to my mother, who was working in a school out a couple of hours away from Frankfurt. He said, when you come back, please wear that blue dress with the little flowers. You look so pretty in it. I would love to see you get off the train wearing that dress. Things like that, which would just, that was my father. It was, so, one has the sense of this very august scholar, deeply serious. But there was also this very tender side. And it came out really also in my father's relationship to Josie, my daughter. He was just a deeply gentle, kind person. I say in the film, when I asked my father when I was about to become chair of my department at Tufts, do you have any advice for me?
Yes, and he says, be kind.
Be kind. Life is so difficult. Just be kind, be gentle.
I love that.
Yes.
That's Ellen Sarah.
Mr. Searle?
Ellen.
Oh, there's somebody down here.
Ellen, you're muted.
I found your film absolutely fascinating. I thank you for it. The part that came most alive for me was the discussion of some of your father's ideas, his textual interpretations. The moment that Michael Fishman came on and started explaining what he saw, what he learned from Nahum about the textual relationship between Genesis and Exodus was totally thrilling and astonishing to me. And I loved his language, a tabernacle of time. I don't know if that was your father's or Michael's innovation, but it's gorgeous poetry. And it so much captures the sense of the deep spirituality and the intellectual discovery that I so appreciate about this man. I'd love to hear more. What he did with Job sounded totally fascinating. I'm not familiar with those texts, but I would love to see more like this or hear more about it. It's just wonderful stuff.
The Job, but there's a book my father edited and introduced on Job called The Dimensions of Job.
Yes.
Which has, do you know the book or?
No, I've seen it from
I don't know if it's still in print or not. Get it at the library, good university library. No, he read texts very deeply. I mean, this comes across in the testimony of Michael Fishbane and also of Elaine Gorian. I think Paul Mendes-Flohr speaks about it less, but he had great depth. And I think that came across in his teaching. And although he was a man of deep reserve and probity, and so it wasn't easy to get to know him. He was quite guarded. But I think he had very few enemies.
I'd love to see his list of jokes as well.
Oh, I have your notebooks. Much of it is now actually at the Brandeis Archive.
Wonderful.
There's a great deal of material that my mother and I gave and that I continually collect and give to Brandeis. Perhaps his little notebook cut out.
I think a little chapbook of those jokes would be very saleable.
That's a good idea. Maybe when the virus is over, I'll go out to Brandeis and copy some out or photograph them. I have some here still at my apartment. Any other questions or comments?
I just wanted to say that his voice, even though it isn't
Okay.
always perfect. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. His voice was beautiful.
Yeah.
It was. I'm gonna have to watch the film again, but his character, in a sense, it seems to me, is in that voice. And I will look into what his books in English are with Shoken, because I was very moved by everything.
I'm delighted to hear. He had a beautiful voice, and he, as I said, he conducted some of the high holiday services at Harvard. But one of the best comments about his voice comes actually from Franz Rosenzweig, whose mother was completely assimilated, and he wanted her to have a sense of the Jewish tradition. They had services in Rosenzweig's study because, as you know, I know from the film, he had ALS and was completely paralyzed. So there were services that were conducted in his attic study. And he wanted his mother to hear my father conduct the service so she would hear his voice and the melodiousness of it, to have a sense of the beauty of the tradition, that should be her introduction to it. My father and Adela Rosenzweig became very close friends. She became like a second mother to him and like another son or grandson to Adela Rosenzweig, and it came by way of my father's voice. But thank you for noticing it.
And that quality is accentuated by having just the cello as the music for the film, I think.
Well, Ellie who's a cellist as well as a visual artist. Yeah, I mean, I just thought, my father loved Bach, and I just thought one of Bach's cello suites would be the right music to use.
That was wonderful.
Sparingly in the film.
Yeah.
We have a question from Sam.
And Frida also.
Audio and Frida. I just want to ask Sam's question. He's asking, his audio isn't working. He's asking what your father's practice in Judaism was.
He was essentially Orthodox, between conservative and Orthodox. We belonged to a conservative synagogue when we lived in Roxbury in the 40s, and in Brooklyn. It was called the Brooklyn Jewish Community Center, something like that. And then when we moved to Watertown, there was no place to go. And so some of the Jewish families in Belmont and Watertown started a kind of community minyan in a house that they rented. And it was non-denominational, and he thought that was how it should be. And then he was active, but he didn't really go to synagogue very much. I mean, we kept all the holidays at home. We always had Shabbat at their house. And as a child, and Josie had the same experience, the long preparations for the Seder, which I loved. He would pray, but to himself, in a very solitary fashion. He was not a person who liked being with people very much. People loved him, but he was.
No, you only wanted to be around the family.
He was deeply private, and he wasn't one for any group activities. So yes, he was devout in his own. He was devout.
You have to fill in.
Sometimes, not that often.
No, I
later,
think more often than you know.
Maybe so.
Every night I slept over.
And of course, he was kosher, and he didn't travel on Shabbat. But if there was something where he needed to go to a synagogue on Shabbat for some reason, I don't remember, then I think he would allow my mother to drive him. But when we were at the Belmont Jewish Community Center, we walked there. We would walk there on a Shabbat morning. And I would walk with my father up to the age of 17. And we would have long discussions. So I would say, Dad, tell me about what Plato thinks about this. And so each time it would be another philosopher, and I would get a mini course in Hegel or in Kant or in Marx. I was interested in philosophy. And so we made good use of the time. I think that's when he taught me. Jerry, do you know this way of, were you taught as a child how to remember the possible birthplaces of Homer?
No, I'm afraid not. Jerry.
I understand it.
My father taught me, one of the things he learned, I guess in gymnasium, was a mnemonic for the birthplaces of Homer, which goes, Smyrna rodos kalafon ios argos Atenae. In the rhythm. So he taught me things like that, very useful things like that. My mother, on the other hand, taught me certain German expressions of a very different order. They were, if a piece of food dropped to the floor, she would say, oh, pick it up and eat it. She would say, Schmutz reine die Magen. Stomach. Or
I have to do what one can to help oneself through a gymnasium.
She had another, what was some of her other questions? Yes. In die allerhöchste Not schmeckt die Wurst auch ohne Brot. In tough circumstances, sausage also tastes good without bread. So she taught me those kinds of sayings while my father taught me Goethe and a little bit of Greek.
Let me ask you, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Let me ask you, this is a very valuable evening and a wonderful addition to the books that I know some of them that you have written about your life. And there's one aspect you might something, namely, when after 1945, there was a flood of Austrian, German, Russian, all kinds of new people coming to this area, you know, to Brandeis, to MIT, to Harvard, and so on. I found about 60 of those that used to be there, from Arnheim to the Weisskopf to Wolfson. And the question is, did your father find among them a kind of a subculture? Some of these did. Tillich, for example, did he find among these also influx people somebody that he particularly cared for?
So he was a great admirer of Tillich. He had been his student in Frankfurt. Tillich signed his doctorate dissertation. So he remained in touch with Tillich. He was a great admirer of Werner Jaeger. He was friendly with Wolfson, who he visited regularly. Aaron Gurvich, who taught philosophy, was a student of Husserl's and the teacher of Merleau-Ponty at Brandeis. Marcuse, who was at Brandeis at the time, was a close friend of my parents. So yes, they had a whole community of German, Austrian, Czech.
Yes.
For instance, I'm blocking on his name, the political scientist at MIT, Deutsch, Karl Deutsch, was a friend of theirs. Leo Gross at Tufts.
Oh, yes.
Most of their friends were almost all European. I know this because my mother taught at Shady Hill. I came home from school for some reason earlier than she did one day, and she said, "Were there any phone messages?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Who was it?" I said, "I don't know, but it was somebody with an American accent."
People really lifted up the scholarship. Before that, in 1930s and so on, one can say that some of these places, including Harvard, they're rather provincial. And the incoming new people made a big difference. And this has never been really written up.
It was very true of art history, because the great art historians all came from Europe, like Panofsky and Held, and Meyer Shapiro was born in Lithuania, but he came as a child, but there were a great many art historians who really changed how art history was done when they came to the US. Much of Brandeis in the beginning had European faculty in the initial faculty, so many of them.
You might want to write up this time.
I don't think I know enough to do that.
Frida.
I bet you do.
Can we hear from Frida has a question.
Frida,
Can you unmute yourself, Frida, please?
Frida, unmute yourself. Can we?
No, she has to do it herself. Just to press.
Jim, can you help
Okay,
Frida?
I'm unmuted. I
Okay,
believe.
there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, Judith, what really strikes me is that you have been so fortunate to have a father who was kind and tender with you, and included himself in your education from an early age, rather than shoving it off onto more academic situations. And it somehow strikes me that that's not that common in people of his generation, from Germany especially. And I wondered whether you had given it some thought, and whether you have some sort of answer, idea of what made him so different from the general cultural upbringing of German men.
Well, I think one is, of course, he didn't grow up in Germany. He was in Lemberg until 1914, so until the age of 11. And I think very much within the family and his school. Then they went to Bodenbach. Again, it's not Germany, it was, Silesia.
Generationally, men didn't
And
do that.
pardon?
Generationally, men of that
Yeah,
era
it's true.
didn't tend to.
They didn't tend to. I was very fortunate, but I can't give a sociological explanation. I think it's a much more
I mean a personal one.
personal
Just within
one.
the context of what you know of.
He was very poetic. He was very artistic. There was that whole other side that actually Susanna Heschel speaks about in the film, that you have the sense that this was a person who experienced love. Not so much at home. I mean, he was adored by his mother. His father was very, very high expectations of him and was very proud of him, but domineering in the way that Kafka's father was on some level, so that my father sympathized with Kafka for that as well. So his father was much more Germanic, although he came from Buchach and then to Lemberg. I can't really explain it. He was very poetic. He was musical. He was artistic. He had that whole other side, which not all scholars have. He was not pretentious at all. I think he was always somewhat, perhaps outside, not fully outside the center of things, and not against the grain, but deeply individual. He didn't fall into a pattern. He made fun of the formality of Herr Dr. Professor, but you didn't call him by his first name. He was
That's
Professor.
significant, isn't it? That he made fun of that.
He always thought that
hierarchy was not the impressive thing for him.
Say again?
That hierarchy was not the impressive thing for him.
No. And he made his own way, and he had to reinvent what he could do, I think, from country to country. But I think behind that was the great strength of my mother, who was very self-assured in a very good sense, and with a great sense of humor, and was deeply supportive. And I think if she hadn't been so strong throughout so many of these migrations, the one to Palestine was very difficult for her. I mean, she was all of 22 and pregnant and just found it terribly difficult. But apart from that, he somehow maintained a kind of spiritual equanimity. I don't know how else to put it.
Mother's love, by any chance?
Mother's love, father's love too. I mean, though his father was deeply judgmental, he writes in a letter which is included in the film after Buber publishes his Hasidic stories. My grandfather writes to my father, I think you should do your own edition of the Hasidic stories. It would be much better than Buber's, he writes. It would be more serious, he said, and it should be beautifully designed. The book should be beautifully designed. I'm sure it would be very successful. So he has, you know, which isn't saying just do the straight and narrow. He's saying you can do this. On the other hand, when my father leaves the Breuer Yeshiva when he's 19 and doesn't dare tell his father for a couple of years that he's left, he was very scared of his father, but he did it. I mean, he went ahead and left the yeshiva, which was extraordinary. At the time, he had left high school, his gymnasium, before he finished the Abitur, before he finished the matriculation, because he went off to Frankfurt to go to the yeshiva to become a rabbi. His father's plan for him. Rosenzweig said to him, look, you've got to get a degree and you've got to go to the university. So after the First World War, the exam was given not without difficulty, I think in Berlin, designed for soldiers who had come back from the First World War and didn't have their high school degrees but needed them. So you could become eligible to take a special exam. Not that my father had been in the army, but with Rosenzweig's help, he was able to take the exam. He was terrified of not passing. It was in Latin and chemistry and all kinds of subjects. And he did pass. It was great. He's an enormous relief. And then he was able to enroll in the university and get his degrees. He got Summa for his PhD, but his education had been cut short. So there were a number of sort of unexpected turns in his development that he maintained his kind of sweetness is extraordinary. Apparently when he was a student in Frankfurt, there was a kind of snobism against him because he was an Ostjude in their eyes. A Jew who came from the East. He came from Lemberg, although it was Austro-Hungary, and German was his language. He hated to be thought of as an Ostjude. I asked Jula Lipschitz, who was my mother's friend from the age of 18 in Frankfurt, how was he regarded? I said, was he regarded as an Ostjude? She said, oh yes, she said, but all the young Jewish women in Frankfurt were in love with your father. So he loved Frankfurt. He absolutely loved Frankfurt. It was for him, it was liberation. It was just a life where he could be on his own and not under the thumb of his father or in a provincial gymnasium, which was anti-Semitic as it was in Bodenbach.
Thank you.
Is that Janet? Do you have your hand up, Janet?
No, it's the pussycat.
Oh.
Maybe we should start if there are no more questions. Glad to entertain.
Oh, thank you so much. This
Yes.
was very touching and enlightening, and we're all we're
Thank you.
very grateful.
So much.
Thank you all for
Yes.
looking at the film and for tuning in. And I urge you to look at the additional scenes. There's a lot of material in it.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much.
Have a good week. Shavua tov.
Good.
So,
Bye, everybody.
Shavua Tov. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Shavua Tov, everybody.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Really
Yes,
nice.
wonderful.
coming,
Wonderful.
Judith.
Thank you.
Yes.
Really?
Do more. And Judith, is there a way we can see those additional features?
yes, it's on for the film on my father. Yes, it's on the same site where the link, it says the film and then it says right underneath it, additional scenes. And you just click and it comes right up.
On Canopy?
I think it's, maybe it's not on Canopy.
I don't think it's on Canopy. You know, if you wouldn't mind like sending Rabbi Jim the link and he could share it with us,
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, sure.
that would be really great. I'd love to see more of that.
Yeah.
Okay, I will
Great
write
idea.
Jim.
Thank you so much.
Ask him
Thank
to do
you.
that.
Thank you indeed.
Bye, Jerry. Thank you so much for tuning
Bye,
in.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful to see you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Wonderful.
Okay, I'm gonna
Yes.
close it off.
Good
Thank
night.
you, Sherry.
Thank you.
Have fun. Thank you.
It was beautiful. Oh, is that Rosie? Huh, I wonder.